It's 821 AD, and on the Irish coast near what's now Howth, Viking longships are pulling up onto the beach. But these aren't just raiders looking for gold and silver. They're here for something far more valuable and infinitely more horrific: human beings. The annals of Ulster record that Atar was plundered by the heathens, and they carried off a great number of women into captivity. This is just one entry in what would become centuries of the most systematic and brutal slave trade Europe had ever seen. When we think about Vikings, we picture fierce warriors with horned helmets sailing across stormy seas. What we don't talk about, what history has largely forgotten, is that these same warriors built one of the most extensive and profitable slave trading networks in medieval Europe. We're talking about a business that lasted for over 3 centuries and trafficked hundreds of thousands of human beings across continent. The Vikings called their slaves thralls, from the Old Norse word aulral, meaning a person in bondage. But this wasn't some small-scale operation run by individual raiders. This was an industrial-scale enterprise that formed one of the main pillars of the entire Norse economy from the 9th to the 11th centuries. The trade of thralls was one of the pillars of the Norse economy from the 9th to the 11th century, and it made the Vikings incredibly wealthy. Think about that for a second. While the rest of Europe was struggling through the Dark Ages, the Vikings were getting rich by turning human misery into profit. They didn't just raid for treasure, they raided for people. Men, women, children, everyone was a potential commodity to be bought, sold, and shipped across the known world. The scale of this operation was absolutely staggering. Slaves, called thralls, were amongst the most important commodities traded by the Vikings. We're not talking about occasional kidnappings here. This was systematic, organized, and incredibly efficient. The Vikings had turned human trafficking into an art form. Here's how their operation worked, and it's more sophisticated than anything you might imagine. The Vikings had established major slave markets in key cities across their territory. Dublin, in Ireland, became one of the largest slave trading centers in medieval Europe. York, in England, was another massive hub. These weren't just local markets. These were international trading centers where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. But the really terrifying part is how far this network extended. People taken captive during the Viking raids in Europe could be sold to Moorish Spain via the Dublin slave trade, or transported to Hedeby or Brno in Scandinavia, and from there via the Volga trade route to Russia, where slaves and furs were sold to Muslim merchants in exchange for Arab silver dirham and silk. Think about that network for a moment. A person could be captured in Ireland, sold in Dublin, shipped to Scandinavia, then transported down the Volga River to Russia, and finally sold to Muslim merchants as far away as Central Asia. The Vikings had created the medieval equivalent of a global supply chain, except instead of moving goods, they were moving human beings. Viking traders went west as far as Newfoundland in the New World, and east as far as the Volga River, down to Constantinople. Their trading network spanned continents, and slaves were one of their most valuable exports. Let's talk about who these thralls were, and how they ended up in Viking hands. The sources of slaves were incredibly diverse, but there were patterns to the horror. Many slaves came from Eastern Europe. The Vikings would launch massive raiding expeditions into what's now Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, capturing entire villages and marching the survivors back to their ships. Ireland was another major hunting ground. The Vikings established permanent bases in Ireland specifically to facilitate slave raiding. Every monastery raid, every coastal attack, every inland expedition had dual purposes: grab whatever treasure they could find, and capture as many people as possible for the slave markets. England wasn't spared either. The Vikings would sweep through English towns and villages, selecting the strongest men for labor, the most attractive women for concubines or domestic work, and even children who could be trained from a young age to serve their new masters. But here's what makes the Viking slave trade especially horrific: it wasn't random violence. It was calculated, strategic, and incredibly organized. The Vikings knew exactly what kinds of slaves brought the highest prices in different markets. Young, strong men were valuable for agricultural labor and construction. Women were prized for domestic work and, let's be honest about this, sexual exploitation. Children were especially valuable because they could be trained and molded to serve their masters for decades. The slave markets themselves were scenes of unimaginable horror. Slaves were distinguished by size, strength, and attitude. or where they came from foreigner who do not know Irish, or women from over the Great Sea. Picture these markets. Human beings lined up like livestock, examined by potential buyers who checked their teeth, felt their muscles, and evaluated their potential usefulness. The Dublin slave market was particularly notorious. It operated for centuries, becoming so large and profitable that it attracted traders from across Europe and beyond. Ships would arrive regularly, their holds packed with terrified captives who had no idea where they were being taken or what fate awaited them. The journey to these slave markets was a nightmare in itself. Captured people would be chained together and forced to march for days or weeks to reach Viking ships. Those who couldn't keep up were often killed on the spot. Once aboard the ships, they were packed into the holds like cargo, with no concern for their comfort, health, or basic human dignity. Many didn't survive the journey. Disease, starvation, and despair killed thousands before they ever reached a slave market. The Vikings factored these losses into their business calculations. They captured far more people than they expected to sell, knowing that a significant percentage would die in transit. But let's talk about what happened to those who did survive to reach the slave markets. The lucky ones, if you can call any of this lucky, were sold locally and might remain in Ireland or England. The unlucky ones faced journeys that could take them thousands of miles from home, to places where they didn't speak the language, didn't understand the culture, and had no hope of ever seeing their families again. The most horrific destinations were probably the eastern routes. Slaves, sold into the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world, faced incredible journeys down dangerous rivers, across hostile territories, and into completely alien cultures. From there, via the Volga trade route to Russia, where slaves and furs were sold to Muslim merchants in exchange for Arab silver dirham and silk. Imagine being a Celtic farmer from Ireland and ending up as a slave in Central Asia, thousands of miles from anything familiar. The treatment of thralls in Viking society was brutal beyond description. Slavery was a deeply entrenched institution in Viking society which was hierarchical, and the lowest social class consisted of thralls and slaves, which made up the main source of hard labor in Norse society. These weren't servants or employees, they were property, pure and simple. They could be bought, sold, traded, beaten, raped, or killed at their owner's whim. Viking law reflected this attitude. Killing someone else's thrall was treated as property damage, not murder. The penalty was financial compensation to the owner, not justice for the victim. A thrall's life had no intrinsic value beyond their economic usefulness to their master. The daily life of a thrall was an endless cycle of backbreaking labor and degradation. They worked the fields, built houses, served in homes, and performed the most dangerous and unpleasant tasks that free Vikings wouldn't do. They had no rights, no protection, and no hope of legal recourse if they were mistreated. Female thralls faced additional horrors. They were routinely sexually exploited by their masters, forced to bear children who would also become slaves, and treated as both laborers and sexual objects. The women captured in those Irish raids mentioned in the annals of Ulster faced fates that were probably worse than death. Children born to thrall mothers automatically became thralls themselves. This created a permanent underclass of people who were slaves from birth, who knew no other life, and who could be bred like livestock to provide the next generation of workers. But here's where the story gets even more disturbing. The Viking slave trade wasn't just about providing labor for Viking society. Viking slavery was not primarily about acquiring slaves for the Nordic countries. Rather, it was a valuable commodity sold on the large slave markets. The majority of captured slaves weren't kept by the Vikings at all. They were commodities to be sold for profit in distant markets. This means that the Vikings were essentially running a human trafficking operation on an international scale. They were capturing people in Western Europe and selling them to buyers in Eastern Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world. They were the middlemen in a trade that connected slave markets from Ireland to Central Asia. The profits from this trade were enormous. Slaves were one of the most valuable commodities the Vikings could sell. A single healthy adult could be worth more than a year's wages for a free Viking farmer. The wealth generated by the slave trade helped fund Viking expansion, shipbuilding, and military campaigns across Europe. Think about the implications of this. Some of the most famous Viking achievements, their incredible ships, their fearsome weapons, Their ability to launch massive expeditions across oceans were paid for with money earned by selling human beings. The civilization we admire for its exploration and craftsmanship was built on a foundation of human misery. The geographic scope of the Viking slave trade was truly staggering. Long before Africans were sold in the Americas, Vikings had a roaring trade in thralls across the seas. They were running transcontinental trafficking operations centuries before the Atlantic slave trade that we're more familiar with from later history. From their bases in Ireland, the Vikings could ship slaves to Spain and North Africa. From their Scandinavian ports, they could send human cargo down the river systems of Eastern Europe. From their settlements in England, they could supply slaves to markets across Northern Europe. The network was vast, sophisticated, and incredibly profitable. But let's talk about the human cost of this operation, because the numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Over the 3 centuries that the Viking slave trade operated at its peak, hundreds of thousands of people were captured, trafficked, and sold. Entire communities were destroyed. Families were torn apart forever. Children grew up in slavery thousands of miles from where they were born. The psychological trauma must have been unimaginable. Imagine being torn from everything you know, shipped across dangerous seas, and sold to people who speak a foreign language in a distant land. Many slaves probably never learned what happened to their families, or whether their children were even still alive. The ripple effects of the Viking slave trade extended far beyond the immediate victims. Communities lived in constant fear of raids. Coastal areas were often abandoned because the risk of capture was too high. Economic development stagnated in regions that were regularly targeted by slave hunters. Ireland in particular suffered enormously from Viking slaving activities. The repeated raids and the establishment of permanent Viking bases like Dublin meant that no Irish community was safe. The Vikings knew the coastline, they had local collaborators, and they could strike anywhere at any time. The psychological warfare aspect was just as important as the actual raids. The threat of being enslaved was a constant source of terror for medieval Europeans. Parents had to live with the knowledge that their children could be captured and disappeared forever. Communities had to choose between safety and economic opportunity, often abandoning fertile coastal areas for less vulnerable inland locations. The end of the Viking slave trade came gradually, and ironically, it had less to do with moral awakening than with economic and political changes. The trade ended with the widespread adoption of Christianity in Sweden, but this wasn't because Christianity suddenly made slavery unacceptable. Christian Europe continued to practice slavery for centuries. What really ended the Viking slave trade was the consolidation of stronger kingdoms across Europe. As countries like England, France, and the various German states became more organized and militarily powerful, Viking raids became much more difficult and dangerous. The easy pickings that had fueled the slave trade for centuries were no longer available. The development of more sophisticated naval defenses also played a role. Coastal communities learned to organize better warning systems and defensive measures. The element of surprise that the Vikings had relied on for so long began to disappear. Economic changes mattered too. As trade networks became more sophisticated and other forms of commerce became more profitable, the relative value of the slave trade decreased. It was still lucrative, but it was no longer the economic driver it had been during the height of the Viking Age. Slavery itself was abolished in Sweden in 1335 by King Magnus Eriksson, marking the formal end of legal slavery in one of the main Viking homelands. But by that time, the great age of Viking slave raiding was already over. The legacy of the Viking slave trade is one that history has largely tried to forget. It doesn't fit with our romantic notions of Viking exploration and adventure. We prefer to think of them as brave seafarers discovering new lands, not as ruthless human traffickers who turned kidnapping into a continental business enterprise. But the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Evidence suggests slavery may have been more central to the Viking story than previously thought. This wasn't a side business or an occasional activity. It was one of the fundamental pillars of Viking society and economy. The scale, sophistication, and duration of the Viking slave trade make it one of the largest forced migration events in medieval European history. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, traumatized, and exploited in service of Viking economic interests. What makes this story particularly tragic is how thoroughly it's been forgotten. The victims of the Viking slave trade left few records of their own experiences. They were mostly illiterate, often didn't speak the languages of their captors, and had no way to tell their stories to history. Their suffering has been largely erased from popular memory. The perpetrators, on the other hand, have been romanticized and celebrated. Vikings are portrayed as bold adventurers in movies, television shows, and popular culture. Their slave trading activities are rarely mentioned, and when they are, they're often downplayed or glossed over as a minor aspect of Viking culture. This historical amnesia does a disservice to the memory of the hundreds of thousands of people who suffered and died in the Viking slave trade. Their stories deserve to be told, their experiences deserve to be remembered, and the true scope of this horror deserves to be understood. The Viking slave trade represents one of Europe's forgotten horrors, a systematic, organized, and incredibly profitable enterprise that trafficked human beings across continents for over 3 centuries. It was sophisticated in its organization, vast in its scope, and devastating in its human cost. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the legitimate achievements of Viking civilization, but it does provide crucial context for how that civilization was built and sustained. The ships, the explorations, the settlements, the military expeditions, all of these were funded, at least in part, by the profits from human trafficking. The story of the Viking slave trade is ultimately a reminder that some of history's most celebrated cultures were built on foundations of incredible cruelty and exploitation. It's a lesson that power and prosperity often come at the expense of the powerless, and that the victims of that exploitation are quickly forgotten while their oppressors become legends. When we remember the Viking Age, we should remember all of it, not just the parts that make for exciting stories, but also the parts that reveal the terrible cost of Viking success. The thralls who suffered and died in service of Viking ambitions deserve to be remembered too, and their story deserves to be told as part of the complete history of medieval Europe.